December 19th, 1944. 11 in the morning. A converted French barracks in Verdun. The room is cold, poorly lit, and thick with cigarette smoke trapped under a low ceiling. Damp wool uniforms steam as they dry. Maps are spread across a long table, their edges curled from overuse. Outside, snow falls steadily, muffling the sound of engines and footsteps. Inside, the Allied command has stopped moving. 3 days earlier, the German army had come out of the Ardennes like something long assumed dead. More than 200,000 men punched through a thinly held American sector. Entire regiments vanished into forests. Communications failed. Supply lines snapped. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, low on ammunition, low on food, wounded men freezing where they lay. Dwight Eisenhower stood at the head of the table. Supreme Commander, calm by habit, strained by circumstance. He did not deliver a speech. He did not frame the moment. He asked a single operational question, flat and precise, because nothing else mattered anymore. Who can attack north to relieve Bastogne, and how fast can it be done? No one answered. Omar Bradley studied the map without speaking. Other senior officers avoided eye contact. They understood the arithmetic. Winter roads, fuel shortages, units already committed elsewhere. Any counterattack would take days to organize. Possibly a week, possibly longer. Bastogne did not have that long. The silence stretched. Then George Patton spoke. His voice cut through the room, sharp, impatient, unadorned. He said he could attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours. The statement landed badly. Some officers assumed it was bravado. Others read it as theater. To do what he claimed required disengaging an entire army already facing east, rotating at 90 degrees, and driving it north through snow and ice. No Allied formation had ever attempted such a maneuver under these conditions. Military logic said it could not be done. Patton did not argue. He did not explain. What no one in that room understood was that the decision being announced had already been made days earlier. This was not a promise formed under pressure. It was a confirmation. And the clock had started before anyone else realized the race had begun. At that moment, the military situation offered a narrow but genuine opportunity. It existed briefly, and it existed only because of how unbalanced the German attack had become. The German offensive through the Ardennes was powerful, but it was also asymmetric. Hitler had committed his remaining mobile reserves into a single thrust aimed west, toward the Meuse and Antwerp. Armor, fuel, experienced formations, and priority logistics were all pushed forward into a narrow corridor. That decision created momentum, but it also created exposure. The German spearhead had length without depth. Its flanks were held by exhausted infantry divisions, many under strength, many short of transport, many dependent on roads that barely supported winter movement. From a purely operational standpoint, the German southern flank was the weakest part of the entire offensive. It rested against American forces that had not been broken, had not panicked, and had not yet been fully engaged. Those forces were facing east, but they were intact. Their supply lines still functioned. Their command structure remained coherent. The German timetable assumed time. Time to reach the Meuse. Time for American command confusion to persist. Time for Allied countermeasures to be slow, fragmented, and cautious. German planners believed any major Allied response would require a full regrouping, redeployment, and build-up. In winter conditions, they expected that to take at least a week. They were not irrational in that assessment. Under standard Allied procedures, it was correct. To attack the German flank quickly required 3 conditions. First, forces that were already assembled, supplied, and combat-ready. Second, a command willing to accept logistical disorder in exchange for speed. Third, advanced planning that treated a German offensive not as a remote possibility, but as an expectation. Only one Allied army met those conditions. Patton's Third Army was not engaged in defensive fighting. It was not fragmented. It had momentum of its own, facing east toward the Saar. Its divisions were experienced in rapid movement. Its headquarters was accustomed to issuing compressed orders and accepting operational risk. Most importantly, its command culture prioritized tempo over neatness. Militarily, the opportunity was not to defeat the German offensive outright. It was narrower than that. The opportunity was to strike the southern flank before German armor could consolidate, before fuel shortages became critical, and before Bastogne fell. If that flank could be penetrated quickly, the German advance would lose coherence. Its timetable would collapse. Its reserves would be forced to react rather than advance. This window was measured in days, not weeks. Weather, often cited as a universal obstacle, cut both ways. Snow and fog hampered Allied air power, but they also limited German reconnaissance and slowed resupply. Roads were bad, but they were equally bad for both sides. The side that moved first accepted confusion and imposed shock would gain the advantage. The opportunity was real. It was not a gamble based on optimism. It was grounded in German force disposition, logistical overextension, and flawed assumptions about Allied response time. But it demanded immediate action. Delay would erase it. Caution would forfeit it. Committee planning would suffocate it. The opportunity did not require brilliance on the battlefield. It required decisiveness in the command room. By the time Eisenhower asked his question in Verdun, the opportunity was already shrinking. Within days, it would close completely. Only one commander had positioned himself to exploit it without hesitation. The warning did not come from a committee, a briefing book, or a consensus assessment. It came from one officer, working a quiet intelligence section, assembling fragments that did not fit the prevailing narrative. Oscar Koch was Patton's G2. His responsibility was not to confirm expectations. It was to identify enemy capability and intent, regardless of inconvenience. In early December 1944, what he saw disturbed him enough to press the issue directly. German formations were disappearing. Not destroyed. Not retreating in disorder. Simply gone from the order of battle. 15 divisions, including armored units that should have been visible through normal reconnaissance channels, no longer appeared where Allied intelligence believed they belonged. Their radio traffic had dropped. Their routine signatures had vanished. Rail movements pointed east to west, not the reverse. Prisoner interrogations stopped making sense. Higher headquarters explained it away. Germany was exhausted. Units were being pulled back to refit. Fuel shortages made large operations impossible. The Ardennes was unsuitable for armor in winter. The war, it was assumed, was winding down. Koch did not accept that explanation. He compared terrain studies, logistical indicators, and historical German operational behavior. He focused on what the Germans needed to attempt a strategic reversal, not on what Allied optimism said they could afford. His conclusion was blunt. The missing divisions were not resting. They were being concentrated. Quietly. Deliberately. Opposite the weakest sector of the American line. He took the assessment to Patton on December 9th. Patton did not interrupt. He did not debate probabilities. He asked one question that mattered. If you are right, when do they attack? Koch answered without hedging. Within 2 weeks. That answer carried weight because Koch had earned credibility long before December. His previous estimates had tracked German movements accurately through France and Lorraine. He was not prone to alarmism. He did not traffic in speculation. When he committed to a conclusion, it was because the evidence converged, not because it was dramatic. Patton accepted the assessment without forwarding it up the chain for validation. He did not seek permission to prepare. He did not wait for SHAF concurrence. He treated the warning as actionable intelligence, not an academic exercise. What followed was not visible to other headquarters. Patton ordered his staff to begin contingency planning immediately. Not abstract options. Detailed movement plans. Route studies. Fuel allocations. Timetables. 3 separate counterattack scenarios were drafted, each tied to a different axis of German advance. Units were identified in advance. Maps of the Ardennes were distributed. Traffic control points were pre-assigned. Logistics officers were told to plan for disruption, not efficiency. This preparation did not require announcing an emergency. It required discipline and discretion. Third Army continued its offensive posture to the east. On paper, nothing changed. In practice, Patton's headquarters was rehearsing a war that officially did not exist. Other commanders saw no reason to do this. Intelligence at SHAF remained cautious to the point of paralysis. Bradley viewed Koch's conclusions as speculative. Eisenhower did not reject them outright, but he did not act on them either. To do so would have meant reallocating resources, adjusting priorities, and publicly acknowledging that Allied assumptions might be wrong. Patton did not share those constraints. He was not responsible for alliance messaging. He was responsible for readiness. By the time the German offensive began on December 16th, Third Army already had answers prepared. not concepts, orders. So when the question was asked at Verdun, Patton was not calculating feasibility. He was recalling a plan already written, already staffed, already rehearsed in outline. The warning had been issued 10 days earlier. It had not changed Allied strategy, but it had changed one army's posture completely. The overrule did not come as a single order. It emerged through hesitation, hierarchy, and fear of being wrong in public. At the top of the Allied command, the problem was not ignorance. It was posture. By December 1944, SHAF had committed itself to a narrative of inevitability. Germany was collapsing. The Western Front was a matter of pressure, not crisis. Major strategic decisions had already been made based on that assumption, and reversing them would have meant admitting that the assessment was flawed. Intelligence that contradicted this view created friction. Acting on it required visible movement of forces, changes in supply priorities, and the reallocation of reserves. That, in turn, would signal doubt. In a coalition command built on confidence and political balance, doubt was dangerous. Eisenhower understood the warning signals. He had seen German recoveries before, but he was managing more than a battlefield. He was balancing British and American expectations, maintaining momentum across a broad front, and preparing for operations already approved at the highest political levels. Preemptive action in the Ardennes would have disrupted all of that. Bradley was more direct. He believed the German army no longer possessed the capacity for a major offensive. His operational experience favored methodical advance and consolidation. From his perspective, reallocating attention to the Ardennes meant weakening active sectors for a threat that might not materialize. He saw Koch's assessment as theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. There was also institutional bias at work. Koch was not a senior intelligence officer at SHAF. He was AG2 under a commander whose reputation for aggression was already viewed with suspicion. Patton's history of insubordination and political embarrassment made anything associated with his headquarters easier to discount. Accepting Koch's warning meant accepting Patton's judgment. That carried consequences beyond operations. Patton was effective, but he was volatile. Empowering him further risked creating a situation where success would strengthen his influence within the Allied command structure. Eisenhower had spent much of the war containing Patton's excesses without sidelining his effectiveness. That balance was fragile. The system responded the way large systems often do. It absorbed the warning without acting on it. Intelligence summaries noted unusual German movements, but framed them as defensive or restorative. Commanders were encouraged to remain vigilant, not to reposition forces. No formal contingency plans were issued at SHAF level. No reserves were shifted in advance. This was not negligence. It was risk management shaped by politics. Coalition warfare punishes visible overreaction as much as it punishes inaction. If the Germans did nothing, an Allied command had disrupted operations based on a false alarm, responsibility would be assigned. Careers would be affected. Trust would erode. The safer course, institutionally, was to wait. Patton did not wait. That difference mattered because when the German offensive began, the response options available to SHAF were constrained by their earlier restraint. Units were scattered. Supply lines were oriented east. Decision-making now occurred under pressure, with incomplete information and deteriorating conditions. At Verdun, Eisenhower's question was not asked in a vacuum. It was asked because the system had run out of time. When Patton answered, the reaction was not relief. It was skepticism. His confidence highlighted the failure of others to prepare. Accepting his offer meant acknowledging that preparation had been possible and had not been done. Yet there was no alternative. No other commander could present a comparable timeline. No other headquarters had plans ready to execute. The system that had restrained Patton now depended on him. The overrule, therefore, took a final form. Eisenhower approved the counterattack not because it aligned with prior doctrine, but because circumstances removed choice. Patton was authorized to act, but only after the crisis made denial untenable. This authorization came without apology and without recognition of what had been ignored. There was no reckoning in the moment. The machinery of command moved forward, absorbing the contradiction. Patton did not receive vindication. He received permission. The system preserved itself by reframing the sequence. The counterattack became a response to German aggression, not the execution of a preemptive plan. Koch's warning remained a footnote. The failure to act earlier was not examined. What mattered, institutionally, was that the alliance held, the front stabilized, and the narrative of control survived. The cost of that restraint would be paid elsewhere, in days already lost and casualties already incurred. By the time the orders were issued, the decision that mattered most had already been made weeks earlier. It had simply not been made by the system. The consequence unfolded exactly along the lines the earlier decision had made unavoidable. When Patton's orders went out, they did not produce elegance. They produced motion. Units disengaged under pressure. Columns backed up on frozen roads. Traffic control broke down almost immediately. Vehicles slid into ditches. Fuel trucks arrived late, or not at all. The maneuver worked not because it was clean, but because it was relentless. German commanders first noticed the effect indirectly. Reports from the southern shoulder of the Bulge described increased American probing. Contact patrols that should not have been there. Artillery registrations where no major formations were expected. What they assumed were local countermeasures were, in fact, the leading edge of a full army turning into their flank. The German timetable began to fracture. The offensive had been designed around speed and surprise, not resilience. German armor at the front was already consuming fuel faster than planners had projected. Resupply columns struggled on the same frozen roads now filling with American traffic. Every hour of delay reduced the margin for reaching the Meuse. Every unexpected engagement forced units to divert strength sideways instead of forward. As Patton's divisions pressed north, the German southern flank bent. Not catastrophically at first. It sagged. Infantry divisions assigned to hold that flank were already under strength. Many had been assembled hastily, stripped from other sectors. They lacked transport and adequate anti-tank weapons. When confronted by American armor and coordinated artillery, they did what doctrine allowed. They fell back. That withdrawal rippled forward. German commanders at higher headquarters now faced a problem their plan had not solved. To preserve the offensive, they needed to reinforce the flank. To reinforce the flank, they had to divert units from the spearhead. But the spearhead was already late. Fuel shortages were worsening. Air attacks, when weather briefly cleared, compounded the strain. The siege of Bastogne, intended to be a temporary inconvenience, became a liability. German units tied down around the town could not be released without admitting failure. Every day Bastogne held, it fixed German forces in place while American pressure grew from the south. Inside Bastogne, the situation was already desperate before relief came. Casualties mounted. Ammunition was rationed. Medical care was improvised. The town held not because relief was imminent, but because withdrawal was impossible. The men inside were enduring the consequences of decisions made far above them, days earlier, when warnings had been deferred. When the breakthrough finally occurred, it was not dramatic in the way later retellings suggest. A tank column reached the perimeter. A road was opened. Supplies began to flow. The encirclement was broken. What mattered was not the symbolism. It was the operational effect. With Bastogne relieved, the German southern flank lost its anchor. Units that had been committed to isolate the town now had to defend against a growing American penetration. The German offensive, already behind schedule, lost coherence. Commanders no longer spoke of reaching the Meuse. They spoke of stabilizing lines. From that point forward, the German attack ceased to be an offensive and became a withdrawal in stages. American and Allied casualties continued to mount. The weather remained brutal. Fighting was intense and confused. None of that changed the strategic trajectory. The decision to ignore the warning had not made German success possible, but it had made German damage far greater than it needed to be. The cost was paid by units caught unprepared in the opening days. Regiments overrun before they understood what they faced. Battalions forced into piecemeal defense. Thousands of men killed, wounded, or captured while higher headquarters worked to re-establish control. Those losses were not the price of defeat. They were the price of delay. Patton's counterattack did not erase that cost. It capped it. It imposed a limit on how much worse the situation could become. The maneuver succeeded because it arrived before German fuel shortages became catastrophic, before reserves could be shifted effectively, and before Bastogne fell. Had it arrived later, the consequences would have been different in scale, not in nature. German commanders recognized this afterward. Their assessments did not dwell on American bravery or Allied numbers. They focused on timing. They had assumed time would belong to them. It did not. The American response arrived earlier than their planning allowed. That early arrival traced back directly to preparation made in defiance of institutional caution. The Allied command structure emerged from the crisis intact. The front stabilized. The bulge was eventually erased. The narrative that followed emphasized resilience, improvisation, and collective effort. These were not false. They were incomplete. What was less visible was how close the system had come to failing its own assumptions, how narrowly the window had been exploited, how dependent the outcome had been on a decision made quietly, without authorization, before permission was granted. The battlefield showed the result, not the cause. By January, the German army in the West had exhausted its final reserves. The offensive had consumed men and material it could not replace. The war's end was now only a matter of time. That outcome was inevitable regardless. What was not inevitable was how many men would die reaching it. The consequences of ignoring the warning were written in frozen ground and casualty lists. The consequences of heeding it, belatedly, were written in a stabilized front and a broken German timetable. Both outcomes flowed from the same original choice. One army had prepared, the rest had reacted, and the difference between those two postures determined who paid the price and when. The post-war record did not resolve the contradiction. It buried it. In official histories, the Battle of the Bulge became a story of endurance. Surprise absorbed. Initiative regained. A crisis met by collective resolve. The sequence was preserved in broad strokes, but the timing was softened. The emphasis shifted away from warning and preparation toward reaction and recovery. Oscar Koch's assessments appeared in archives, not narratives. His reports were filed, cross-referenced, and rarely quoted. They confirmed that German concentration had been detected. They also confirmed that the information had not been acted upon at the level where it mattered. No corrective followed. No formal inquiry was convened to examine why the signals had been discounted. Patton's role was framed carefully. His counterattack was praised for speed and aggression, but it was treated as an improvisation born of crisis. The prior planning was mentioned only in passing, if at all. The implication was clear. Success had emerged from character under pressure, not from preparation against ignored warnings. This framing served institutional needs. Acknowledging that the offensive could have been anticipated raised uncomfortable questions. It suggested that Allied command optimism had crossed into assumption. It suggested that intelligence failure was not about collection, but about acceptance. Those conclusions did not strengthen trust in the system that had just won the war. Eisenhower's own post-war writings reflected this balance. He emphasized unity, adaptability, and resilience. He did not dwell on the intelligence debate preceding the German attack. To do so would have meant assigning responsibility in a victory narrative that depended on cohesion. Bradley's memoirs were more direct, but still restrained. He acknowledged surprise. He did not concede preventability. In his account, the German offensive was bold, unexpected, and nearly impossible to foresee and scale. That interpretation preserved his operational judgment without challenging the structure that supported it. Patton's papers told a different story, though even there the tone was controlled. He recorded Koch's warning. He noted the dates. He described the contingency plans. He did not claim credit in public for having anticipated the attack. He did not need to. His satisfaction lay in execution, not acknowledgement. Koch himself returned to obscurity. He continued his career. He received no reprimand and no distinction. His accuracy did not translate into influence. In the post-war army, intelligence officers who had been correct but ignored occupied an uncomfortable position. They demonstrated failure without offering a system-friendly explanation for it. German records, released later, completed the picture. After-action reports confirmed the concentration of divisions. Fuel allocations matched Koch's estimates. Timetables recovered from German headquarters aligned closely with his prediction. There was no mystery in hindsight. The offensive had been real, deliberate, and visible to those willing to see it. What the post-war record ultimately revealed was not a failure of competence, but a failure of alignment. Intelligence, command authority, and institutional confidence had not converged. When they finally did, it was under pressure, not by design. The Allied victory absorbed that inconsistency without correcting it. Success made the examination unnecessary. The system moved on. Careers advanced. Histories were written. The war ended with the proper conclusions intact. What remained unresolved was simpler and more precise. One warning had been accurate. One preparation had been sufficient. One response had been delayed because acknowledging it early carried more institutional risk than ignoring it. The post-war record did not dispute these facts. It simply arranged them so they no longer demanded attention. The case closes at the point where cause and outcome finally align. The Battle of the Bulge was not saved by inspiration under pressure. It was limited by preparation made in advance. The difference mattered. The central decision was not Patton's counterattack. That was execution. The decision that shaped the outcome was made earlier, quietly, when one commander chose to treat an unwelcome warning as real. That choice produced plans. Those plans produced speed. Speed imposed limits on German success. The Allied system did not fail because it lacked information. It failed because acting on that information carried political and institutional cost. Confidence had hardened into assumption. Changing course risked embarrassment, disruption, and loss of authority. Waiting felt safer. Waiting was not neutral. The men lost in the opening days were not casualties of German brilliance alone. They were casualties of delay. Units that could have been reinforced were exposed. Positions that could have been adjusted were left thin. The price was paid before correction became unavoidable. When correction came, it relied on the one commander who had prepared without permission. That reliance did not produce acknowledgement. It produced absorption. The system survived by reframing the sequence, not by examining it. Patton emerged effective but contained. Koch emerged correct but invisible. The alliance emerged intact, which was the priority that governed every earlier choice. The German offensive failed because it ran out of time. That outcome was not accidental. Time was taken from it by preparation that had been dismissed as unnecessary until it became indispensable. The verdict is narrow and final. The battle was not won by collective foresight. It was won despite its absence. One warning was enough. One army listened. The rest reacted. History recorded the victory. It did not record the avoidance of greater loss that never happened because one decision arrived early enough to matter. If you want more closed-case examinations of World War II decisions stripped of mythology and comfort, subscribe to the channel. If you have a view on where this system failed, leave it in the comments. This case is complete.